Thank you very much, Ernest, for that kind introduction. And as ever, it's a great pleasure to be back here at the AERC biannual. I think the theme, as both the chair and our guest speaker said, is very relevant. And in my presentation, I want to approach the question of fiscal reform slightly indirectly through the lens of public investment, growth, and fiscal reforms. So this is work that I've been doing recently with David Bevan, a colleague at Oxford and a long-time friend of the AERC. David is currently not around. He's doing something more interesting, sailing in the Arctic Circle at the moment, so he's not with us today. But this is joint work. Let me make one other observation on this paper. It's based on some work we've been doing for the research department of the IMF under a program on the macroeconomics of low-income countries. There is an IMF working paper as well as the version of the paper that was circulated, and I believe the slides from today's presentation will be made available on the web as well. There's bits and pieces in here that differ slightly from the paper. Okay, so the outline of my talk is reasonably pedestrian in the sense I'm going to introduce the problem, I'm going to talk about a model, I'm going to look at some policy experiments, and I'm going to conclude with some observations and the usual statement that more research is required on this topic. The way I want to get at questions of fiscal reform is through the lens of public investment and the enthusiasm for increased public investment to close infrastructure gaps. I'm going to argue that this perspective must not exclude a focus on three key issues in public finance. These are issues of recurrent costs, the recurrent costs of public capital, questions of appropriability, the ease with which the return to public investment can be captured through cost recovery by the public sector, and its interaction with distortionary tax systems. We're going to take those three observations and put them into a model. It's now a pretty standard model that has been developed over the last few years at the IMF to look at debt sustainability in a slightly more general equilibrium way than has historically been the case. And we're going to ask the question, what happens to a kind of standard set of model simulations if you allow for these important public finance issues? I'm going to run through just a couple of experiments to give you a flavor of what we're doing and then conclude. I should start by saying this is not in any sense a new topic. Issues about recurrent costs and public investment are as old as recurrent costs and public investment themselves. It's an issue that recurs. It was a theme that you see in the literature in the 60s, and the 70s, the 80s. It has not gone away, partly because it's a very deep and difficult issue to address within a political economy framework. So, let me proceed, if I can. Sorry, this is going to be a strange process today. Okay, so the infrastructure gap. This is my starting point. There's a lot of talk about the infrastructure gap. These numbers come from something called the Africa Infrastructure Country Diagnostic, a large-scale work that the World Bank has undertaken to look at gaps, deficiencies in the capital stock. You see similar analysis in the Commission for Africa, in IMF publications, in AFDB publications. But this is quite useful because what it's suggesting is that the continent as a whole, just in the hard infrastructure of power and communications, is looking at a spending gap of around about just under $100 billion per annum to close this estimated infrastructure gap. That's roughly about 10% of GDP per annum. But the point that I wanted to focus on is the fact that a huge part of closing this gap is on the recurrent cost, operations and maintenance side. And we know what that actually means. Deficient operations and maintenance is this. It's roads that are poorly maintained, it's pharmacies that are empty of drugs, it's overcrowded classrooms. This is the operations of public capital. It's infrastructure that is dilapidated and has huge economic costs. So there's a very strong perception that the social return as well as the private return to public investment may be very high. And in a sense, we see this in the next slide when it comes up. There we go. Sorry, this is going to happen. Every time I press it, it's going to jump forward too. This is a picture looking at some of the recent sovereign bonds. There's a sense that this is a historically good time to be borrowing, a good time to be accessing both domestic and external capital markets, partly because, perhaps with the exception of countries such as Ghana at present, yields are pretty low by historical standards, reflecting low real interest rates around the world, and that the returns to public investment are high. This will give you plenty of time to read every slide as I try and change from one to the next. But what I want to say in this talk is that this enthusiasm for public investment must face these three home truths about the public finance dimension of public investment. Number one, recurrent costs are often much larger than anticipated. Operations and maintenance expenditures are not just large, but they're inevitably vulnerable to tight fiscal conditions. It's the obvious thing to cut back on when times are tough, when external agents, either private or public, are asking for fiscal consolidation. Skimping on the maintenance, skimping on the operations of public capital is the obvious thing to be attacked first. Future capital stock doesn't have a vote today is part of the problem. It's hard to mobilize support around maintenance in a way that it's easy to mobilize support around preservation of public sector wages, for example. However, the problem is that deficient operations and maintenance undermines the ex-post return to any public capital investment that we're considering. The second point I'm going to make is that the returns from public investment are difficult to appropriate, either through user fees or levies, and very often not for technical reasons, but for well-understood political economy reasons. The political ability to charge users for public services may be compromised. The implication of this, of course, is that that shifts the financing burden, both for the investment and for operations and maintenance of the capital stock, onto the domestic tax system, which itself typically is characterized by quite high distortions that undermine growth. Okay, so what this paper is about is saying that these features ought to be present in any conventional debt sustainability analysis, any framework that you're going to use to look at public investment. And typically they're not. Standard models tend to consider only some depreciation costs of public capital, not the full operations and maintenance implications. They also tend to assume that there are relatively non-distortionary taxes available to the authorities. This is very much the feature of an important paper in the IMF by Ed Buffy and colleagues, which is very popular as a vehicle for looking at some of these issues. It's an excellent paper. Our paper is an attempt to try and extend it a little bit to bring this public finance reality in. And as I'm going to show you in this presentation, once we bring these features in to the question of public investment and growth, we can show quite easily that the returns to fiscal reform, and by this I'm going to mean two things. One, tax reform, at the margin making the tax system less distortionary, and budgetary reforms that protect recurrent costs have very large payoffs, and payoffs that may be as large as the returns to new public investment, even when ex-ante social returns are high.